Ernest Borgnine. He was a Hollywood legend with a tough guy reputation and a famous gap-toothed smile. He could play the villain or the hero, the everyman or the lovable lug, and steal a scene with just a look. He was an Oscar winner, a Navy veteran, and one of the most hard-working actors of his generation. But behind that friendly grin, Borgnine was a man of fierce principles who never, ever minced words. He worked with the biggest names in the business, but there were some he simply could not stand. Using his own words and stories from those who knew him best, we're naming the actors who earned the lifelong contempt of Ernest Borgnine. From on-set explosions to personal betrayals he carried to his grave, you might know the co-stars, but you don't know the whole story. For over 60 years, Ernest Borgnine built a career on being dependable, professional, and brutally honest. He was a working man's actor in a town built on illusion, and he had zero patience for the egos and tantrums he sometimes ran into. While many of his professional relationships were warm, a select few were so toxic, so deeply bitter, that they've become the stuff of Hollywood legend. These are the stories of a man who valued the craft above all else and refused to suffer fools, no matter how famous. From the leader of the Rat Pack to Broadway's most notorious diva, this is the real story of the actors Ernest Borgnine truly despised. To understand why Ernest Borgnine clashed with certain people, you have to understand the man himself. He wasn't Hollywood royalty. Ernest Borgnine was born in Hamden, Connecticut, to Italian immigrants. His early life was about humility and hard work. When his parents briefly separated, he even spent several years in Italy with his mother. This upbringing gave him a down-to-earth perspective he never lost. Long before he ever stood in front of a camera, Borgnine looked for purpose not in an acting class, but in the United States Navy. He enlisted in 1935, served for 6 years, and was honorably discharged in late 1941, right before the attack on Pearl Harbor. When the country went to war, he didn't hesitate to re-enlist, serving until 1945 and reaching the rank of gunner's mate first class. Those 10 total years in the military weren't just a line in his biography. They were the bedrock of his character. The Navy taught him discipline, respect, and that every single person has a job to do for the whole operation to succeed. That was the ethos he brought to every film set. When he returned to civilian life at 28, acting wasn't even on his radar. It was his mother who famously told him, "You always like getting in front of people and making a fool of yourself. Why don't you give it a try?" Taking her advice, he used the GI Bill to attend the Randall School of Dramatic Art in Hartford, Connecticut. From there, he joined the acclaimed Barter Theater in Virginia, where he truly began to hone his craft. His professional stage debut was at the Barter, and he hit Broadway in 1949 in the play Harvey. Borgnine's approach was that of a craftsman. He saw acting as a job that required you to be on time, know your lines, and respect your colleagues. He wasn't interested in Hollywood drama or entitled attitudes. He was a blue-collar actor who showed up and did the work. And that deeply ingrained sense of professionalism is the key to understanding the feuds that would later define his career. When he met actors who he felt disrespected the craft, the crew, or the spirit of filmmaking, he didn't just disagree. He held them in contempt. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of values. The most famous of Ernest Borgnine's feuds was with the one and only Frank Sinatra. Their animosity was forged during the making of one of the greatest films of the 1950s, From Here to Eternity, and it simmered for the rest of their lives. The year was 1953. Borgnine was cast as the sadistic stockade sergeant Fatso Judson. Sinatra, meanwhile, was at rock bottom. His record sales had tanked, and his affair with Ava Gardner made him a press pariah. He was desperate for the role of Private Angelo Maggio, seeing it as his only way back. The legend, fueled by The Godfather, says the mafia got him the part, but the reality is Sinatra lobbied hard, even taking a huge pay cut. From the moment they met, the tension between Borgnine and Sinatra was electric. On screen, they were tormentor and victim, and that dynamic bled into their real-life interactions. Borgnine was a pro, focused on the work. Sinatra, by many accounts, brought an entourage and an entitled attitude. Borgnine saw Sinatra's behavior as arrogant and dismissive of the cast and crew. The climax of their on-screen story is the brutal scene where Fatso beats Maggio to death. Borgnine's performance was so terrifyingly real it had real-world consequences. For years, people would try to pick fights with him on the street for what he did to Frank Sinatra in the movie. While Sinatra's performance won him an Oscar and resurrected his career, the on-set animosity, from Borgnine's point of view, never really went away. In a twist of fate, Borgnine won his own Best Actor Oscar in 1955 for Marty, beating out Sinatra, who was nominated for The Man with the Golden Arm. Despite some reports that they eventually buried the hatchet, and Borgnine's own late in life, story that they exchanged Christmas cards signed from Fatso and from Maggio, other sources insist the personal dislike remained. To Borgnine, Frank Sinatra embodied the kind of Hollywood ego he could never and would never tolerate. While Frank Sinatra's ego grated on Ernest Borgnine, his conflict with their From Here to Eternity co-star Montgomery Clift was different. This was a clash of acting philosophies, Borgnine's disciplined professionalism versus Clift's all-consuming volatile method acting. Montgomery Clift was a pioneer of the method, an approach that demanded deep psychological immersion. For his role as the sensitive bugler, Private Prewitt, Clift learned to play the bugle and carried one everywhere. He was known for his quiet intensity and his ability to project incredible vulnerability. Borgnine had no time for it. To him, an actor's job was simple: learn your lines, hit your marks, deliver a performance. He found Clift's on-set process self-indulgent and unprofessional, believing it slowed things down. He saw Clift not as a dedicated artist, but as an emotionally fragile man whose work was inseparable from his troubled life. Their conflict peaked while filming the knife fight between Fatso and Prewitt. It was a grueling, physically demanding sequence, and the tension wasn't just for the cameras. Borgnine recalled the fight was a brutal piece of choreography that left him black and blue. However, Borgnine's opinion of Clift was more complex than simple contempt. In his autobiography, Borgnine admitted Clift had immense talent, writing, "He just oozed sincerity in all his scenes, and that really helped me and the other actors get to the top of our game." This hints at the core of Borgnine's character. He could separate the work from the man. He might find an actor's process frustrating, but he respected a final product that served the film. Unlike his feud with Sinatra, which was about disrespect, his issue with Clift was about methodology. For Borgnine, the blue-collar actor, acting was a job you left at the studio. For Montgomery Clift, the tortured artist, it was a life you could never escape. Working with John Wayne was a rite of passage for any Hollywood tough guy. Ernest Borgnine and the Duke were titans of rugged American masculinity. But when they finally shared the screen, it was a relationship marked by professional respect and personal friction. Borgnine openly admired Wayne's iconic screen presence. He knew Wayne was more than an actor. He was an institution. Off-screen, however, Borgnine found the Duke to be domineering and difficult. He described working with him as walking on eggshells, a phrase that reveals the tense atmosphere Wayne could create. Borgnine felt Wayne always had to be the center of attention, the unquestioned leader, both on and off camera. This clashed with Borgnine's more collaborative team player mindset. Borgnine loved to tell a story about running into Wayne at the Polo Lounge. After their wives started chatting, the two actors sat for a drink. Wayne looked at him and said, "God damn it, Ernie, how come we've never worked together?" Borgnine, after a few drinks, cheekily replied, "I don't know, John. Maybe it's because you're afraid to work with good actors." Borgnine would laugh telling the story, adding that, Wayne was a class act who took the jab well. But the joke held a kernel of truth. Borgnine saw himself as a versatile character actor, while Wayne, in many ways, always played John Wayne. It wasn't a feud born of hatred, but a professional distance kept when two very different kinds of titans had to share the same space. Of all the difficult relationships in Ernest Borgnine's life, none was more explosive, public, or comically short than his 32-day marriage to Broadway legend Ethel Merman. This wasn't a co-star feud. It was a matrimonial meltdown of epic proportions. They married on June 27, 1964. He was a famous film actor. She was the undisputed first lady of the musical comedy stage. On paper, a power couple. In reality, a disaster. The trouble began on their honeymoon. Borgnine was a movie star recognized worldwide. Merman, a Broadway icon, was not. According to Borgnine, fans would mob him for autographs, and when he introduced his new wife, the great singer Ethel Merman, he was met with blank stares. For a woman used to being the star, this was unbearable. The final straw came in Japan. Over. Borgnine filed for divorce, and it was finalized just 42 days after they said, "I do." Merman got the last word. In her 1978 autobiography, she included a chapter titled, "My Marriage to Ernest Borgnine." When readers turned to it, they found a single blank page. It was a savage and unforgettable dismissal. Borgnine was more direct, claiming the marriage ended simply because fans paid more attention to him. It was a battle of two colossal egos, and there was only room for one. Not every tough guy actor was a rival. Borgnine's relationship with Lee Marvin, another hard-nosed Hollywood veteran, was the complete opposite of his clashes with Sinatra and Wayne. They weren't enemies. They were kindred spirits, fellow veterans who built a lasting friendship on mutual respect. Their bond started on the set of the 1953 film The Stranger Wore a Gun. Borgnine recalled being picked up by a studio limo and seeing a long-legged guy with a little overnight satchel already inside. It was Lee Marvin. A former Marine who'd been wounded in combat, Marvin immediately sized up Borgnine, who had packed 2 large suitcases. "You serve?" Marvin asked. When Borgnine said Navy, Marvin grinned and replied, "I thought so. Way, you're all packed up for a long sea voyage." It was the start of a friendship that would last for decades. They worked together again in classics like The Dirty Dozen and Emperor of the North. On The Dirty Dozen, as two of the older, experienced W2 vets in a cast of young actors, they shared a natural camaraderie. Their most intense collaboration was Emperor of the North, a brutal film where Borgnine played Shaq, a sadistic railroad man, and Marvin played A-No-One, the hobo determined to ride his train. The film ends with a vicious fight between them, and their real-life friendship allowed them to push each other to savage on-screen limits. Lee Marvin saw a side of Borgnine that many missed, once calling him the biggest womanizer in Hollywood, a compliment to his genuine, unpretentious charm. Their friendship lasted until Marvin's death in 1987. It's a powerful reminder that in Borgnine's world, shared principles and mutual respect meant more than any on-screen rivalry. Lee Marvin was a man who understood Borgnine's code perfectly. Over. A long career, an actor's name can get tangled up in stories that aren't quite true. For Ernest Borgnine, one of the most persistent and inaccurate feud stories involves the 1954 film Johnny Guitar and the legendary on-set war between. It stars Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge. While Borgnine was in the film playing a henchman named Bart Lonergan, he was more of a shocked witness than a participant. The hatred between Crawford and McCambridge is notorious. The director, Nicholas Ray, hoped their real-life dislike would create on-screen tension, but he quickly realized he'd made a huge mistake. The feud escalated into outright psychological warfare. In one infamous incident, A drunk Crawford reportedly gathered McCambridge's costumes, drove down a highway, and threw them onto the road. Tensions were so high their scenes often had to be filmed separately. Some reports claim their arguments turned physical, requiring co-stars to pull them apart. But there's no reliable evidence that Borgnine was ever one of them. He later called it one of the most unprofessional things he'd ever witnessed. So, while the idea of a Borgnine-Crawford feud makes for a good story, it's Hollywood fiction. Borgnine was a bystander, a professional actor watching in disbelief as two stars engaged in a personal war that nearly derailed the production. He didn't hate Joan Crawford, but the chaos undoubtedly reinforced his intolerance for the kind of monstrous ego that put a film at risk. He had his own battles to fight, but this one wasn't his. Ernest Borgnine was more than the characters he played. He was a man of substance, a product of a different time, governed by a strict code of discipline and respect, values forged not in Hollywood studios, but on the deck of a Navy destroyer. His 60-year career is a monument to the idea that real talent doesn't need a glamorous facade. The feuds that marked his journey weren't born from a cranky nature, but from a deep intolerance for anything that disrespected the craft. His clash with Frank Sinatra was about ego. His disagreement with Montgomery Clift was about the nature of acting itself. And his brief, fiery marriage to Ethel Merman was a lesson in what happens when two monumental egos collide. Yet, his lasting friendship with a fellow tough guy like Lee Marvin proves his gruff exterior hid a capacity for great loyalty when he found a kindred spirit. Ernest Borgnine was famously candid, a man who truly wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He was the ultimate blue-collar star in a white-collar town who outworked, outlasted, and outacted many of his peers. The stories of the actors he hated aren't just gossip. They're the legacy of a man who demanded respect, not for himself, but for the work. In a town often built on illusion, Ernest Borgnine was unapologetically, fiercely, and brilliantly real. So what's your take? Was Ernest Borgnine a principled professional or just a pain to work with? And what other classic Hollywood rivalries do you find fascinating? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this look into Hollywood's golden age, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from behind the silver screen. Thanks for watching.